The jungle is silent. Not peaceful, not calm, but unnaturally, completely silent. No birds call from the canopy. No insects hum beneath the leaves. Even the wind seems to hesitate, as if the air itself is holding its breath. A research team moves carefully through the dense undergrowth, each step slow, deliberate. Their boots sink into the damp earth. The smell of wet soil and decay hangs heavy, almost suffocating. Sunlight barely reaches the ground, filtered into thin, fading streaks that vanish between towering trees. One of them stops. Not because they heard something, but because they didn't. In ecosystems like this, silence is never empty. It means something has changed. Then it happens. A subtle shift somewhere ahead. Branches don't snap, leaves don't rustle, but something moves, large enough to displace space itself. A shadow where no shadow should be, low to the ground, heavy, controlled. Watching. The team freezes. Instinct takes over. Cameras lower. No one speaks. Because in that moment, every rational explanation begins to feel insufficient. Whatever is out there is not behaving like anything they expected. Local communities have warned about this place for generations, not with stories of monsters, but with quiet, consistent rules. Don't enter, don't stay after dusk, and if the jungle goes silent, leave immediately. They don't describe what lives here in detail, only that it's been here longer than anyone remembers. Something ancient. Something that doesn't need to be seen to be feared. And as the silence deepens, one question becomes impossible to ignore. What kind of creature can erase an entire jungle just by being present?
Across the world, there are places that exist on maps, but not in human experience. Regions that are not restricted by law, yet remain largely untouched. Not because they are impossible to reach, but because, over time, people have chosen not to go there. This jungle is one of those places. From above, it looks like any other dense tropical forest. An endless stretch of green, layered with life, shaped by millions of years of evolution. Rivers cut through it like veins. Mist rises from the canopy at dawn. It appears vibrant, alive. But on the ground, the story feels different. Villages that border this region share a pattern. They farm at the edges. They hunt in safer zones. But there is always a boundary, an invisible line that no one crosses. Not out of superstition, but out of experience. The warnings are consistent. Don't go too far. Don't stay after sunset. And if the forest becomes silent, turn back immediately. What's striking is not the fear itself, but the consistency of it. These accounts are separated by distance, by language, by culture, and yet they describe something remarkably similar. A presence. Not seen clearly, not often, but felt. When descriptions are given, they follow a pattern that is difficult to ignore. A large, low-moving body, thick, textured skin, a movement that is not fast, but controlled, deliberate, almost calculated. Some describe it near water, others deep within the densest parts of the forest. And then's the detail that stands out most. It doesn't behave like an animal that fears humans. It behaves like one that simply doesn't need to. At first, it's easy to dismiss these reports. Human perception is imperfect, especially in environments that distort sight and sound. Dense vegetation limits visibility. Light breaks unevenly through the canopy. Familiar shapes become unfamiliar. Shadows stretch, merge, and move in ways that confuse even trained observers. But patterns matter. And when similar descriptions emerge over time across unrelated communities, science begins to ask a different kind of question. Not, is this true, but what could be causing this? Because history has shown that local accounts are not always wrong, just misunderstood. There have been moments when science caught up to stories, when creatures once dismissed as myth were later confirmed as real, not because they defied biology, but because they existed in places we hadn't looked carefully enough. Still, there is a problem. According to everything we understand about Earth's history, creatures that resemble dinosaurs should not exist today. Around 66 million years ago, a massive asteroid impact triggered one of the most significant extinction events in the planet's history, the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction. It reshaped ecosystems, collapsed food chains, and eliminated approximately 75% of all species, including all non-avian dinosaurs. This is not speculation. It is supported by global geological evidence, fossil records, and decades of research. So if something in this jungle appears to match that description, something large, reptilian, ancient in form, then there are only a few possibilities. Either the observations are being misinterpreted, or the creature being described is something entirely different, something real but not yet fully understood. Because evolution doesn't simply erase the past, it reshapes it. Traits persist, forms adapt, and sometimes organisms emerge that resemble something far older, not because they are unchanged, but because certain designs never stopped working. Which leads to a deeper, more precise question. If this isn't a dinosaur, then what exactly is moving through this jungle, and why has it remained hidden for so long?
To understand what might be hiding in this jungle, we have to move away from imagination and toward biology. Because nature does not operate on mystery, it operates on rules. Energy, survival, adaptation. If a large, unknown creature truly exists here, it must obey those rules. It must eat, it must reproduce, it must leave some trace of its presence within the ecosystem, and that's where the investigation begins. First, scale. Large animals are difficult to hide, not because they are visible, but because they leave evidence. Footprints pressed into soft ground, feeding marks on vegetation, remains of prey. Even their waste contributes to nutrient cycles that scientists can track. Ecologists, including those working with organizations like the National Science Foundation, use energy models to estimate how many large animals an ecosystem can support. These models are based on available biomass, the total amount of life that can be consumed and sustained within a given area. In dense tropical forests, that energy is already accounted for. Predators compete, herbivores balance plant growth. There is very little unused space for an undiscovered population of massive creatures to exist undetected, which leads to an important conclusion. If something is there, it likely isn't enormous in the way we imagine dinosaurs to be. Instead, we need to look at a different category of life, one that is far more elusive: reptiles. Reptiles are among the most efficient survivors on Earth. Unlike mammals, they are ectothermic, meaning they rely on external heat sources to regulate their body temperature. This allows them to operate on significantly less energy. They eat less frequently, move less often, and can remain motionless for extended periods without stress. In environments like jungles, this is a powerful advantage. A reptile does not need to constantly search for food. It can wait, hidden, patient, almost invisible. Consider modern examples. Large monitor lizards, such as the Komodo dragon, can grow to impressive sizes and dominate their environments as apex predators. For centuries, their existence was known only through local accounts, often dismissed as exaggeration, until Western science finally confirmed them. Crocodilians offer another clue. They have existed in some form for over 200 million years. Their body structure is so effective that it has required minimal evolutionary change. Low-profile bodies, armored skin, powerful jaws, a lifestyle centered around water and ambush. They are not relics of the past. They are proof that some designs are simply too efficient to replace. Now, imagine a similar creature adapted to dense jungle conditions. Not gigantic, but substantial, perhaps 2 to 3 meters in length, strong, low to the ground, spending much of its time in water or thick vegetation, moving primarily at night when temperatures drop and visibility decreases. Such an animal would not need to be seen often to survive. In fact, its survival would depend on the opposite, remaining unseen. The jungle itself enhances this invisibility. Dense vegetation limits sightlines to just a few meters. Sound behaves differently, absorbed, scattered, or distorted by layers of leaves and branches. Even large movements can become almost silent under the right conditions. And then there's decomposition. In tropical climates, organic material breaks down rapidly. Scavengers, bacteria, and humidity work together to erase evidence in a matter of days, sometimes hours. A carcass does not remain long enough to be easily discovered. Tracks are washed away by rain. Disturbances in the environment are quickly reclaimed by growth. In this system, absence of evidence is not unusual. It is expected. But there's another factor: behavior. Predators do not reveal themselves unless necessary, especially those that rely on ambush. Movement is calculated, energy is conserved, encounters are brief, and importantly, many animals actively avoid humans, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Humans are unpredictable, loud, disruptive. From an evolutionary perspective, avoiding us is often the safest strategy. This creates an asymmetry. We enter the jungle expecting to observe, but in reality, we are being observed first. Some reptiles, such as certain snakes, possess infrared sensitive organs that allow them to detect heat signatures in complete darkness. Others are highly sensitive to ground vibrations, sensing movement through the substrate long before it becomes visible. To such creatures, a human presence is not subtle. It is a signal, clear, detectable, and easy to avoid. Which raises an important possibility. What if the reason we rarely encounter this creature is not because it is rare, but because it is exceptionally good at staying hidden? And what if the descriptions that sound like dinosaurs are not misinterpretations of something imaginary, but imperfect glimpses of something real, adapted so precisely to its environment that it exists just beyond the limits of our perception?
For the people who live at the edge of this jungle, the question of what exists inside it is not abstract. It is not a scientific puzzle. It is a boundary, a line drawn not on maps, but in memory. Generations have grown up with the same understanding. There are places you do not enter, paths you do not follow, and times of day when the forest is no longer safe. These rules are not enforced by authority or law. They are passed down quietly through observation, repetition, and experience. What makes these accounts compelling is not how dramatic they are, but how consistent they remain. Across different regions, among communities separated by language and geography, similar patterns appear. Hunters describe moments when the forest suddenly goes silent. Fishermen speak of water that feels disturbed without visible cause. Elders recall rare encounters, brief, unclear, but enough to reinforce caution. These are not stories told for entertainment. They are instructions for survival. Anthropologists and ethnobiologists have long studied how indigenous knowledge systems encode environmental information. Researchers affiliated with institutions like the Smithsonian Institution have documented how oral traditions often preserve accurate observations about animal behavior, migration patterns, and ecological risks. In many cases, what appears to outsiders as myth is actually compressed data, refined over generations, stripped of unnecessary detail, and shaped into something memorable enough to pass on. A warning does not need to explain everything. It only needs to work. When multiple communities describe a similar type of presence, something large, elusive, associated with silence and avoidance, science does not take it as proof of a specific creature, but it does recognize a pattern worth investigating. Because behind every persistent story, there is usually a trigger. Sometimes that trigger is a known species behaving in ways that are not yet fully understood. Large predators, for example, can alter entire ecosystems through their presence alone. This concept, often studied in modern ecology, shows how even the perception of danger can reshape behavior, not just in animals, but in humans. Fear is not random. It is adaptive. A single encounter, rare, intense, and poorly understood, can influence how an entire region is perceived for decades. Over time, that perception becomes embedded in culture. People avoid certain areas, paths are abandoned, entire zones become what might be called silent territories. And something remarkable happens when humans step back. Nature expands into the space we leave behind. In these undisturbed regions, ecosystems begin to behave differently. Animal populations shift, some species become more visible. Others, especially those sensitive to human presence, find refuge. In this way, fear can unintentionally create conservation zones, places where biodiversity thrives, not because they are protected by law, but because they are protected by belief. This has been observed in multiple parts of the world. Sacred forests, taboo zones, and culturally restricted landscapes often contain higher levels of biodiversity than surrounding areas. The absence of human interference allows ecological processes to continue with minimal disruption. But this also creates a paradox. The same fear that protects these ecosystems also limits our understanding of them. Scientists are cautious when approaching such areas, not only because of the physical challenges, but because of the need to respect local knowledge and boundaries. Modern research increasingly recognizes the importance of collaboration with indigenous communities, rather than overriding their perspectives.
And when this collaboration happens, something important becomes clear. Local knowledge is rarely about exaggeration. It is about pattern recognition. People who live in close connection with an environment develop an awareness that is difficult to replicate through short-term observation. They notice changes, subtle shifts in behavior, sound, or movement that outsiders might miss entirely. So when they describe something unusual, it is not coming from imagination. It is coming from attention. That does not mean every detail is scientifically precise. Memory can distort, language can simplify, fear can amplify certain elements. But beneath those layers, there is often a real observation, a moment where something did not fit the expected pattern of the environment. And that is where science becomes interested, not in proving the existence of a living dinosaur, but in understanding what environmental factor could produce such a consistent response across different human populations. Modern tools are beginning to help bridge this gap. Technologies like camera traps allow continuous passive observation without human presence. Environmental DNA sampling can detect species through traces left in water or soil, offering a way to identify organisms that are rarely seen. Acoustic monitoring captures soundscapes over long periods, revealing patterns that human ears might miss. These methods have already led to significant discoveries, new species, expanded habitats, and behaviors that were previously undocumented. But even with these advancements, there are still uncertainties. Occasional data points that don't fully match known species, signals that suggest presence without clear identification, gaps that remind researchers how much remains incomplete. And yet none of this points directly to something as extreme as a surviving non-avian dinosaur. Instead, it points to a more grounded reality, that the natural world is more complex than our current maps suggest, that there are still interactions, behaviors, and even species that we do not fully understand, and that human perception, shaped by culture, experience, and instinct, plays a powerful role in how these unknowns are interpreted. In the end, the creature described in these jungles may not be a single clearly defined animal. It may be a combination of factors: a real organism rarely seen, an environment that distorts perception, and a cultural memory that preserves the experience of encountering something just beyond explanation. For those who live there, that combination is enough. They do not need a name, a classification, or a confirmed discovery. They only need the understanding that some places demand distance, and that sometimes the most important knowledge is not what you can prove, but what you know not to approach.
By now, the question has sharpened into something more precise. Is there truly a living dinosaur hidden within this jungle? From a scientific standpoint, the answer is clear. No known evidence supports the survival of non-avian dinosaurs beyond the mass extinction event that occurred approximately 66 million years ago, widely known as the Cretaceous-Paleogen extinction event. The fossil record across continents, combined with decades of geological and biological research, points to a near-total collapse of large dinosaur lineages following that event. An animal of that scale, surviving undetected for millions of years, would require a breeding population, a stable food chain, and a continuous ecological presence. These are not subtle conditions. They leave patterns, fossils, remains, genetic traces that science has not found. But the story doesn't end there, because the idea of a living dinosaur is not entirely wrong. It is simply misunderstood. In evolutionary biology, dinosaurs did not vanish completely. They transformed. Modern birds are now classified as avian dinosaurs, direct descendants of theropod lineages that survived the extinction event. Their skeletal structures, respiratory systems, and even aspects of their behavior link them unmistakably to their ancient ancestors. Every bird in flight is, in a very real sense, a continuation of the dinosaur lineage. But birds are not what people imagine when they describe something moving through a jungle. The creatures reported in these regions, low, heavy, reptilian, align more closely with another category: ancient body designs that have remained effective over vast spans of time. Crocodilians, for example, have existed in recognizable forms for over 200 million years. Their success lies not in change, but in stability. Their bodies are optimized for ambush. Their metabolism allows them to survive on minimal energy. Their sensory systems make them highly efficient predators in low visibility environments. Similarly, large monitor lizards exhibit traits that can easily be perceived as prehistoric. Their movement is deliberate. Their presence is quiet but powerful. In the right conditions, especially in dense jungle terrain, they can appear far larger, more mysterious, and more ancient than they truly are. What emerges from this is a different understanding. The reports of living dinosaur are not descriptions of an impossible survivor from deep time. They are interpretations of real biological traits, traits that have persisted because they continue to work.
The human brain, when faced with something unfamiliar yet vaguely recognizable, searches for the closest reference point. And for many, that reference is the image of a dinosaur, an ancient, powerful reptile moving through a primal landscape. But evolution does not preserve creatures exactly as they were. It preserves what is effective, and sometimes what is effective looks very old. There is also the role of perception. In environments where visibility is limited and encounters are brief, the mind fills in gaps. Size can be exaggerated, movement can feel more deliberate, silence can amplify tension. What lasts only seconds can be remembered as something far more significant. This does not mean people are inventing what they see. It means they are interpreting it. And interpretation is shaped by context, by culture, by expectation, by the stories that already exist. So when someone encounters a large, unseen presence in a silent jungle, the conclusion is not drawn from nothing. It is drawn from a combination of sensation, memory, and inherited understanding. In that sense, the living dinosaur is real, not as a species, but as an idea grounded in genuine experience, a way of describing something that feels ancient, powerful, and just beyond clear identification. The jungle, then, is not hiding a creature that defies science. It is revealing something more subtle, that even in a world mapped by satellites and studied by advanced technology, there are still moments where human understanding lags behind reality. And in those moments, the unknown does not appear as something entirely new. It appears as something that feels very, very old.
The jungle was never empty. It only felt that way because we didn't understand what we were looking at. For centuries, humans have stepped into places like this carrying a quiet assumption that the world has already revealed its secrets, that what remains unknown must either be insignificant or imagined. But the deeper we look, the more that assumption begins to unravel, because nature does not organize itself around human understanding. It operates on its own logic, its own timelines, its own priorities. And sometimes, what we interpret as mystery is simply a gap between what exists and what we are able to perceive. The idea of a living dinosaur is powerful, not because it suggests something impossible, but because it forces us to confront something uncomfortable, that we might not recognize the extraordinary, even if it's right in front of us. In many ways, the creatures we've been searching for were never meant to be found easily, not because they are hiding with intention, but because they are perfectly adapted to environments that resist observation. Environments where sight is limited, sound is distorted, and presence is felt more than seen. The jungle doesn't protect them, it simply allows them to exist on their own terms. And perhaps that is what unsettles us most. Not the possibility that something unknown lives there, but the realization that it doesn't need us to know. Because throughout history, every major scientific discovery has followed the same pattern. First, disbelief, then curiosity, then slowly understanding. Not everything we fail to explain is extraordinary, but everything we assume we fully understand deserves to be questioned. So maybe the real story was never about a dinosaur. Maybe it was about perspective, about how easily the human mind turns uncertainty into myth, and how rarely it pauses to reconsider those myths in the light of evidence. The jungle does not hide monsters, it hides complexity, layers of life interacting in ways that are difficult to see, difficult to measure, and even more difficult to interpret. And in that complexity, there is a quiet reminder that the world is not smaller than we think. It is larger, deeper, more intricate, and still in many ways unfinished in our understanding. So the next time we hear a story about something that shouldn't exist, the question may not be whether it's true or false, but whether we are asking the right question at all. Because sometimes the unknown is not a failure of knowledge, it is an invitation to look closer, to think deeper, and to accept that even now, there are places on this planet where reality moves just beyond the edge of certainty, and that may be the most fascinating discovery of all.